Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We're going to continue with the story of Saul, but first we're going to say the blessing for studying Torah. Here we go. So if you could mute yourselves, even though I'd like you to join in on the blessing, that would be great. Thank you. All right, here we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage in the words of Torah. So last we left Saul, he had been anointed as king, and you remember that he was sort of still in the mode of farmer, right? He was on, out plowing the fields with his oxen, even though he's already been anointed king. But then there's the threat of a military fight from the, I don't remember, it was the Amorites, I think, and the Philistines. Anyway, he is victorious, and now he's proven his mettle, and he's becoming someone that they can respect and look up to a little bit more. And he's also developing some self-confidence, because we noticed that he was a very humble man. And, he hid when they were, when they were choosing the lots to pick who's going to be king. I mean, there's several stories of his coronation, right? There's the oil poured over his head, but there's also the lots. And, he's hiding in the baggage because he is just not someone who's ready to take on the kingship. But now he's getting closer. So we're going to look at the next chapter, which is Samuel chapter 13. And who would like to read this?
I can read.
Thank you, Doug.
Saul, oh, one moment. My screen just went weird. There we go. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were from Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal.
Let me just stop you just for 1 second. So the Hebrews, according to, I believe it's Alter, Hebrews is the word that was used by the enemies of the Israelites. So when he announces, "Let the Hebrews hear," supposedly that is a way to rouse the people to battle, because it's an insult, right? So bang, let's go. All right, thank you, keep going.
The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Bet-Aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings," and Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him.
Okay, let's just stop for 1 moment. So I don't know if you remember, but Samuel said, wait there a certain number of days, and I will come and do a sacrifice. So what is Saul doing here? Which is a typical Saul move. Christine, if you're, go ahead.
Yeah, he's completely ignoring any advice, and with his usual, intellectual acumen, doing exactly what he shouldn't be doing.
Exactly, he's doing what he shouldn't be doing. It's also sort of pleasing the crowd in a certain sense, because his soldiers are getting antsy. They're nervous, and and apparently they're needing to make a sacrifice in order to have good luck in the battle. And so they're nervous and all that. And he is, kind of taking over Samuel's function. And apparently the troops are starting to abandon him because they're too nervous, as you see some of them cross the Jordan, etc. And so with the sacrifice, they're assuming that they're going to make God happy, who will help them win their battle. Now, at the same time, it is not a sin for a non-priest to give a sacrifice. We've seen plenty of our characters in the Bible offer sacrifices. It is not just the high priest or the priest who has to do that unless you're at the Temple of Jerusalem. So in a certain sense, it could very well be, we don't know, but it could very well be that Samuel is setting him up for failure, because Samuel's not showing up when he says he will, right? And maybe on some level, he knows, this guy Saul, he's a crowd pleaser. People are going to get nervous. He's going to get nervous, and he's going to go ahead and do what I told him to wait and let me do. So it's possible that he's setting him up. It's also possible that it's sort of a test. Like, are you, able to, have some patience? Are you able to keep the troops in order without the sacrifice happening? I mean, there may be a series of tests that he's really subjecting him to. Yes, Lynn.
Yeah, I'm thinking before now, you've gotten the feeling that Samuel, he really doesn't want a king. So maybe he's just trying to keep as much power as he can.
Yeah.
Sort of the test and all that would be for that reason.
Yeah, I think that's very possible.
I'm with Lynn.
I'm with Lynn too. Yeah.
I think Samuel is very jealous. I think that this is, once again, we're doing everything new now. We have a whole new paradigm where God is not the king and the king is the king. And Samuel and God are having to adjust to this brand new situation, as is Saul. And I think the rabbi brought up a good point, which is Saul isn't able to keep the troops together. I don't know if David would have been able to do it at this early stage of kingship. Once again, everybody, we have to understand that everything is new to everybody. And I think everything is a test.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. How many tests do you have to pass?
Correct.
I agree with you, Jane. And yet I also think that Saul is very ambitious. I'm not Saul. Samuel is very ambitious. He really wants to be the power behind the throne. And he doesn't seem to think that, Saul's ridiculous. I mean, I really am no Saul fan, as you can tell, but that he's, it's more than being a crowd pleaser. I think that he really is, he just wants to be, I am the king, but nothing behind it. And I think that his offerings are insincere, Okay,
Right.
we'll give him an offering, and at the same time, I don't want to let Samuel off the hook here. I think that he is setting him up, and I think he's been setting him up since he anointed him, and he's afraid that he's created a kind of monster. So he wants to. It's not a test. I think it's like, get back in your place. I'm the power behind the throne.
Right. May I correct you just slightly, Christine? I wouldn't say that Samuel wants to be the power behind the throne. I would say that Samuel wants to be the power.
He wants to be the power. Okay.
So, yes, and I will
to him.
I will say in Saul's defense, a la Jane, again, that this is the very beginning of things. And the poor guy, it's not like anyone said, here's an army for you. He's just had to, scrape a few people together, and somehow create this, national army when it's all been a bunch of tribes before who,
Exactly. As in Judges. I'm sorry to
exactly.
interrupt.
That's,
But
that
we
was,
saw
that was,
in Judges, they left when they felt, time to
Forget it.
time to
Yeah.
harvest. We got to go
Yeah.
now.
right, right.
No
Yeah.
So,
Philistines or no Philistines. We're
Right.
leaving.
so you just had, a bunch of tribes that occasionally get together, a couple at a time, not
Right.
all of them, to fight an enemy, sometimes the Philistines, sometimes other enemies. And now all of a sudden, here's this poor guy who's been anointed and he doesn't really have the structure of a state yet.
Mhm.
And, he's sort of doing the best he can. Now, at the same time, on the other side, supposedly you are supposed to be able to resist public opinion when you're a political leader. And we know how that works in this country,
Really?
don't we? If it weren't for that, we might actually get some legislation passed. But remember who else gave into public pressure? You remember in the Torah
Yeah.
when people were getting nervous and antsy?
During Moses' time.
I'm sorry,
Aaron.
Jenny.
Aaron.
Aaron.
I just thought, yeah, the golden calf.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly,
Reminds me.
exactly. So you had Moses up on the mountaintop. He didn't come exactly when he said he was coming. And people got nervous and thought he was never coming back. And Aaron said, okay, let's do something. Give me all your gold. We'll create this other God. And of course, when he was confronted, do you remember what he said when he was confronted about why he did that? That
People
somehow
wanted me to.
People demanded it.
What's
People
that?
wanted me to.
No, that it's, I threw the gold in there and it just kind of came out as a calf. I, really didn't have much to do with it in the first place.
Also sounding like one of our presidents.
Right. And as we continue here, you'll see that Saul has a similar response. So let's go back here. And Doug, if you wouldn't mind, so we're on verse 11 where Samuel is confronting Saul.
Okay. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah and Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600.
Now, notice, thank you for pausing. As you probably knew I was going to barge in. So notice that Samuel says you have not kept the command of God. And it really was not God's command. It was Samuel's command. So, he really does have a bit of a power complex, Okay, so.
But what about, we need to stay on this paragraph.
Oh,
Can
okay.
we go back to that paragraph?
Yeah.
Oh, because Samuel says, God, the Lord has already sought out another man after his own heart. Your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler. Okay, so no sooner are you in than you are out,
Right.
Saul. And how would you like to be king and have that hanging over your head?
Right. Well, yeah, it happens
Yeah.
quite quickly. And then we're going to see another reason that.
Yeah,
It's
but
not-
here, all he did was offer a sacrifice,
Right.
Well,
Well, supposedly in
which is
contra,
not against the law from what
Right.
you've just told
from what I
us.
said, yes.
Yeah.
Although Samuel has decided that it is.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's see
So
what
if
happens.
I were God, I would strike Samuel down.
Oh dear, well, Samuel ain't going to be struck down. Not only that, there are 2 books named after him. Okay. Okay, Doug, if you would continue.
Israel without weapons. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah and Benjamin when the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned towards Opera and in the vicinity of Shaul, another towards Bet Horon, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. But not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for reappointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them.
So there's no blacksmith. All right. So they can't do this. But you know, in the Isaiah quote, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. That is not a metaphor. That used to happen, that, you know, you would have metal implements to farm with, and then you needed to go to war and you'd have them melted into something like a weapon, and vice versa. So when Isaiah says one day that's going to happen, we're going to beat our swords into plowshares, in other words, go from war to peace, that's actually not just like some beautiful metaphor. It is a reality of how people used to do things. Interestingly, so you got the small contingent of soldiers left over. All they have is some sharpened farm implements. Miraculously, Saul and his son have weapons. How is it that they miraculously have weapons? Okay, so the Orthodox commentary says that Saul always carried a knife for kosher slaughter, so his soldiers would have kosher meat. That's from Vayikra Rabbah, which is a midrash on Leviticus. I think that's hilarious. I mean, just the way apparently
Right.
Abraham, when he welcomed the strangers into his tent and had Sarah make a meal for them that consisted of dairy and meat all together, the rabbis say, no, they waited the right number of hours between both, you know, because they knew the kosher laws already, like they actually existed. The kosher laws that they're talking about didn't happen until the Talmud. Okay, which is 2,000 years later. Okay, but whatever. So apparently Saul was very conscious of kosher slaughter. So he always had a very sharp knife on him, ready to provide kosher meat to his soldiers. And so therefore he had a weapon. All right, before we go on to the next chapter, yes, Christine.
Yeah, well, I think he might have been a little nervous about his followers, but and you know, keeping a knife about you might be a life-saving device.
Right.
But also I wanted to make something about the metal and the transformations of metal from war implements into peace implements. This is a standard old statescraft thing, because the Chinese emperor, you know, those beautiful bronze bowls and everything happened because the new dynasty confiscated all of anything that could be used as a weapon, melted them down, and made the bronzes. So this is basically disarmed the people. And so the Philistines are just doing what states do.
Yeah, like it's sort of like a gun buyback, sort of.
Yeah. Well,
Let's make sure they have no weapons.
You don't get anything back.
Right. Right.
So I also have a quick comment.
Any other? Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
I'm not sure if I'm in your field of vision, but
Yes, you are.
so just reminded again about something that was said a paragraph or so back, which is that this is the tribe of Benjamin, and so the geography is a little curious, because actually they were really not all that far away from Gaza, which was the center of Philistine territory. And there are really all these descriptions here and elsewhere in the Tanakh of these glorious battles against the Philistines, where there was a lot of smiting going on there, and tens of thousands of Philistines were dying in these battles. But actually, it seems as though the Israelites were kind of trying to stay away from the Philistines as much as they could. They were up in the Central Highlands, and Philistines were down coastal area, and except for the glorious battle of David and Goliath, where David scores this amazing victory. So it's kind of curious, but it's interesting too.
It's curious. Is your question why they are even engaging in battle with the Philistines, or?
No, just overstating all these glorious victories. That
I see, the glorious victories. Of course. Because who wrote this? Not the Philistines.
Right. That's right.
Right. You're absolutely right. Okay. Are there any other comments before we move on? No? Oh, okay, Jenny.
Myself here, there we go. I guess also putting in maybe a good word for the Philistines, sort of counterintuitive, but they were actually a fairly, advanced culture, and they're always portrayed, negatively, and yet, and we even use the word Philistine when we're referring to someone, who's uncouth and, uncultured, and yet actually that's not a fair description.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, no, they were definitely more advanced in terms of weaponry and whatever else, right? But of course, they're uncircumcised, so we'll see what happens to them as a result of that. Okay, so let's go to the next chapter. So we'll go to chapter 14. And anybody want to read? Or Doug, you want to continue?
Yeah, I can continue.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So one day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father.
And do you think, but he did not tell his father, is a foreboding of something that ain't going to be so good? Somehow, okay. Go ahead.
Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left.
Okay, let me just mention a couple of things. The contrast between Jonathan going over, forward on some sort of a mission, and Saul sitting under the tree. I mean, he's, proven himself to be a warrior, but, when given a choice, I think he would just rather, plow the land or sit under a tree and not actually do anything. And not to be too disparaging of Saul, but that there's a contrast here. The other thing is, notice the priest that Saul is relying on from the line of Eli. Remember, Eli's line got kind of booted out in favor of Samuel's line because Eli's sons were corrupt. So it's kind of interesting that, he's clearly not relying on Samuel. He's got this other priestly line with him. Yes, Jane.
But also Samuel's sons are also corrupt because they couldn't become high priests.
Right, but
I saw that in the previous chapter.
Right. But he's relying. Okay, so Samuel's son are corrupt, but Samuel is still around. But it's sort of like, the house of Saul and the house of David, relying on the house that has been, basically disenfranchised. He's going with this other line of priests who are corrupt or rejected. Let's put it that way. And then also notice that this guy has an ephod. Remember, that's that sort of front piece that is worn where there's the Urim and Tumim, where they cast lots to figure out what's going on, sort of divination devices. And, it would be probably better for him to rely on a prophet of God than on the priestly line that has been rejected and tossing these divination stones around. But yeah, it's, listen, who wrote this? The people who are victorious, right? From the house of David. So they're not going to make Saul look great. We can read between the lines and say poor Saul didn't get much of a chance, which is true. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, so we are now, no one was aware that Jonathan had left. This is going to be very important. You will find out in a moment.
So on each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other was called Senech. One cliff stood to the north towards Michmash and the other towards the south, or the south towards Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few."
So here again, it's really important to note that victory is in the hands of God, right? That's why Saul made the sacrifice before, because he's trying to please God. You can be a great warrior, but if God's not on your side, forget it. Okay.
"Do all that you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on, then we will cross over towards them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there, wait until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre.
So you see, Jonathan is a wily warrior. And this is something that, Israel still does today. You sort of set something up and trap the enemy into thinking that there's either more of you or you're not going to attack or whatever it is. So he's found a way to get them to come out and he attacks them instead. So he's out there fighting the battle while his father's sitting under a pomegranate tree. Okay, here we go.
Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." And at that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Bet-aven.
So you see, again, God is responsible for this, right? Scaring on these Philistines, so they're actually attacking each other rather than attacking the Israelites. Okay, now this is going to be very important. These little subtitles are Christian. They're not Jewish at all, neither are the numbers, but okay, let's see what happens. Go ahead.
Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food.
Okay, apparently, there was a tradition of fasting before you go into battle. So he's making this vow: let anybody who eats food, is going to be cursed. Now, you make a vow like that. Does that sound like any other? Do you remember anybody else making a stupid vow like that? From very recently, the book of Judges. Remember?
The first person who comes out of my house.
Exactly. Jephthah. Remember, Jephthah says the first person that comes out of my house, if I win this battle, is going to get killed. And he very well might have anticipated that it was his daughter, because women used to come out and celebrate a victory in battle. And anyway, it's just a stupid vow, because it's like so unpredictable what that's going to be. And let's see what happens here. Let nobody eat, right? Well, who was missing to hear that?
Jonathan and his armor bearer.
Yes, Jonathan, we've been told twice now, no, 3 times actually. Jonathan didn't tell his father. No one knew where Jonathan was. Jonathan's missing when they start looking for the soldiers. And now there's a vow. Uh-oh. So let's see what happens.
The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint."
So it says in the Orthodox commentary, Jonathan's eyes were dim, but once he ate the nectar, his eyes lit up. So
Yeah.
is that
Sugar
nice?
rush.
I'm sorry?
A sugar rush.
Oh, yeah, a sugar rush, right. Okay, maybe he was diabetic. I don't know. Okay. So here we go.
So Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?"
So apparently the men were already hungry. And so the vow to have them not eat was apparently not so bright because they were weak. And if they had eaten something, maybe they would have been able to really rout the Philistines for good. But unfortunately, they're hungry.
That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmas to Ajalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating the meat that has blood in it." "You have broken faith," he said. "Roll a large stone over here at once." Then he said, "Go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it." So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this.
Okay.
Saul,
Sorry. So, okay. So from Jonathan eating this honey, which was forbidden, you have this gluttonous orgy of people eating meat, right? But meat with the blood, which is absolutely forbidden, right? In the Torah, it says you don't eat the blood. It's, the force of life, and you don't eat that with the animal. And then he's building an altar, because if you build an altar and you kill an animal, then the blood can drain out of the animal rather than having it be there to be eaten. So
Is that the large stone that he says roll it over here?
yeah,
Okay, so
Yeah.
for the slaughter. Okay.
for the altar,
For the
yeah.
altar.
Yeah. So, it's a big mess. It's a big mess. And maybe if Saul had not told people you're not allowed to eat and he had let them have a decent amount of food, they would have done better in battle, and they wouldn't have performed this terrible transgression of eating the blood and the meat. But they were so famished that they just, devoured all this stuff. It's pretty gross. Okay. Any comments before we move on?
Well, Jonathan seems like a really good military guy.
Yeah.
Take care of your soldiers first,
Yeah.
Don't send out in advance to make sure that you can have a chance of victory. I mean, he's a soldier.
Yeah.
He's like a good soldier.
Right.
And he thinks his father is a doofus.
Well, his father gets him into some pretty deep trouble here, right? All right, let's see what happens. Now, you do remember we had the vow of Jephthah with his daughter. Now we've got the vow of Saul with his son. So let's see what happens. Okay, let's go down here. Okay,
There we go. Saul said, let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. Do whatever seems best to you, they replied. But the priest said, let us inquire of God here. So Saul asked God, shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day.
so notice that poor Saul keeps asking God for some direction, some, future that he can predict, and God will not answer him. Samuel's the only one who gives him any kind of direction. Okay.
Saul therefore said, come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, you stand over there, and I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here. Do what seems best to you, they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim, but if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Tumim. Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and men were cleared. Saul said, cast the lot between me and Jonathan, my son, and Jonathan was taken.
Now, remember that this business of the lottery is normally a way to find somebody who's done something wrong. Remember way back in the book of Joshua, one of the soldiers transgressed and they did a lottery to find out who it was. And Saul was picked by lottery, which is not the most elevated way to be chosen because, again, it's normally to find out who's guilty, which is what they're doing right here. And I don't know why Jonathan didn't step forward himself and say it was me, but okay.
Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. So Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey at the end of my staff, and now I must die. Saul said, may God deal with me, but it ever so severely if you do not die, Jonathan. But the men said to Saul, should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against the enemies on every side, Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them.
Thank you. So, unlike what happened to Jephthah's daughter, nobody stood up for her. She got killed. They gave her a reprieve of a few days where she could, go into the forest with her girlfriends, but then that was it. It was a few months, I think, actually. But anyway, here they stand up for good old Jonathan, right? And save him. So not very equitable as far as the various genders are concerned. Any comments? Laments over, yes, Gail.
Oh, no,
Okay, you just unmuted for, yeah, okay. Gender wise, this is very problematic. Because also with the Akedah, with the binding of Isaac, he's saved at the end also. So why wasn't Jephthah's daughter saved?
because she's only a girl, right? She's not
Exactly.
a king.
Yeah. So
Right.
that's quite an unfortunate reality here, but that's just the way. Yeah.
It shows where women are in the pecking order.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not even close to the pecking order. You're what's pecked.
Well, we go from, Jephthah sacrificing his daughter to the Levite chopping up his concubine.
Yeah, lovely.
So,
But I also think that, the people are standing up for Jonathan. Oh, the men are, because he's the only military leader that made a difference, and there, meanwhile, you've got Saul sitting under the bloody pomegranate tree. It's like, really?
Saul's also a soldier. I mean, he doesn't just sit on the
know.
pomegranate tree.
I
But
know,
yeah,
but-
Jonathan's a good asset to have.
But
Yeah,
he made this oath, the stupid oath with all these bad things happen because he made this oath.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, especially when you don't know where your kid is
yeah.
and he hasn't been around to hear your vow. It's really not really the greatest thing to say if anyone eats anything. And then, of course, Jonathan says, I just touched it with the tip of my spear. It's like a kid saying, I didn't eat the cookie. I just, nibbled off a little crumb at the edge,
Right. I just
Right?
ate the chocolate chips, not the cookie.
Right, exactly. It's kind of a cute defense, but I just did a little taste. That was all, So is that transgressing the vow or not? If you just took a little taste, is that not eating? How do you define eating? I never had sex with that woman. It's how you define
Yeah.
these words, right?
It's also, can you be transgressive if you have no clue that it was forbidden?
Well, yeah, of course.
Was Saul allowed to build
An altar?
yeah, was he
Yeah.
allowed?
People build altars all the time. If you look at the Torah, people are constantly building altars. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that the cult gets cleaned up and that you're only allowed to have sacrifices at the central temple in the place that God will show you, which happens to be Jerusalem, but it's not explicitly said. Where are we at this point? We're in a place where there's really no centralized system yet for the
And
religion.
like you
So
said, they have to drain the blood, so
Yeah.
they need, if you're going to eat, you have to build an altar.
yeah, well, you'd have to build something to drain the blood, but in terms of sacrifices, no one at this point has said there's a central temple in Jerusalem and therefore you are not allowed to do this, right? That'll come next.
What year would this be?
This is, let's see, it's about the 11th century BCE, around then.
But they think it was written about the 6th, 7th century.
Okay, I know. So Aaron Weisben gave a presentation about who wrote all these different parts of the Bible. And he may very well be right. There's a lot of dispute over when things were written. So this was probably written, I don't know. Yeah, it could have been written much later. We don't know for sure. Like the J source, which is the source that refers to God as Yahweh, I was always told it was the oldest source. Now Aaron is saying it's not the oldest source, or maybe there's new scholarship that says that, but I was told that that was written in the 10th or the 9th century BCE. He's saying it's later. Hard to say, we don't know for sure.
I think they feel that Elohim, when they use the term Elohim, that's the older name. for
That's
God.
what he was saying, but actually while he was lecturing, I actually looked it up
Yeah.
and I found something that said that the J source was older. So, there's the scholarship is,
The word El is a name for God for, I think the Hittites, and Hem is plural for us. So it's
yeah.
God plural. It's something that we borrow that's very old. That's
Yeah.
why they think the name Elohim is.
Right, I get that. And maybe that's true. All I'm saying is scholars don't agree on which one was the oldest source.
Yeah.
Because how are you going to prove it? You say, oh, we're using this word and there's this grammar and there's whatever.
Well, they even argue about the times of King David, whether it was all brought together at that time or there wasn't that time. And then the major argument for the difference in the timeline has just found Finkelstein has just found archaeology just outside Jerusalem that proved his whole thesis was wrong.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's
Yeah,
constant back and forth because, new discoveries and new theories. But again, Richard Elliott Friedman wrote the book, Who Wrote the Bible, which is really who wrote the Torah, not the whole Bible. And he basically details a documentary hypothesis that came out of Germany, which is why the J source is called J, even though we refer to God as Yahweh, because they pronounce the J as a Y in Germany. So his thesis is that there are 4 sources, the documentary hypothesis. Now, since then, they've said there are probably way more sources than 4. You know, if you were Orthodox, you'd say there's one source. Guy
This is
upstairs.
All
Right.
new ways of looking at the Bible. You know, since the Enlightenment, we've just looked at different ways than just take it literally. Now we're looking at it literally, the literature of it.
Yeah.
You know, looking at it. Yeah. So it's
Yeah, the literature of it is really fascinating also.
yeah.
And, you know, and then you can also say, like the Orthodox would say, well, the different names of God show different aspects of God. Elohim is God as, you know, judge, the, you know, sort of the harsher side of God. And Yahweh is more the, you know, the sort of chesed, you know, loving kindness part of God. Maybe. It's
Rabbi,
you know,
what is Shaddai?
Shaddai is another name for God, and it
Oh,
actually
okay.
comes from the word Shaddayim, which means breasts.
Oh.
So I think there were mountains that, you know, looked like breasts,
Mhm.
and people thought, well, God is there or something, you know, and that's also the feminine one of the feminine aspects of God. So there are lots and lots of names of God that are supposed to indicate different aspects of God. All right, so
One other comment is these details about the food are actually pretty interesting.
Yeah.
The pomegranates, I guess, are fairly ubiquitous in the desert portion of the Levant, and it's a center of trade routes that go through there anyway. And but the honey is very curious, and the description of the honey is even more curious because there's all this honey all over the place. It's in the trees, it's on the ground, and there are no bees around. So
I
that's
think
why they
it's
call them
probably
honeybees. That's
it's
what
probably like date. I think it's like date honey as opposed to, you know,
Oh.
bee honey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so,
But yeah, it's interesting also when the Israelites leave Egypt and then they start complaining, I miss all the flesh pots and the cucumbers and the onions and the melons, and they remember all this delicious food they used to eat as slaves. Kind of doubt it, but you know, in retrospect, things always look less painful. All right. Does somebody want to pick it up from Doug? I don't want Doug to.
I'll do it if you need.
Great, thanks, Jane. Okay, so we are
Where
at
are we?
right here, 47.
Oh, okay. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who plundered them.
Well, I'm glad you read that, Jane,
Good.
because
Yeah,
Jane,
it's a good
this,
military leader.
yeah, look,
Look at
yeah, he's not a
Yeah.
complete jerk.
this. Even though he likes to sit under pomegranate trees, so do I.
Well, maybe
Okay.
he just needed to regain his forces, you know, and just kind of took a break, which is, you know, we're all allowed to take a break, right?
Yes. Saul's sons were Jonathan, Yishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of his younger was Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Doesn't Ner mean light?
Yeah.
Ner.
Mhm. Mhm.
Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel.
So Abner was his cousin. Now, all these names mean something. Shaul means to ask, right? People asked for a king, Sha'al, and they got Shaul. Yes, all these names mean something. Now, look at verse 52.
All the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service.
What does that mean?
I think it means that Saul was building an army.
Yep.
And also he's not afraid of men who are strong.
Right.
Somebody who could challenge him, perhaps.
Okay.
You
But
know,
also, I just want,
how many of us have hired people that we know would never challenge us? Okay, you know, I mean, you don't want to be replaced by the new guy.
yeah. So that's a good observation, but also he's instituting conscription, right?
Yeah.
Conscription to the army. And that's one of the things that Samuel warned against, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
You put a king,
Build up an army.
he's going to build an army and conscript you. He's going to tax you. He's going to get you to do some work like a corvée. So, you know, this is exactly what's happening. Not that it's bad, but it's just what Samuel predicted. All right. So before we go on, let me just check and see if anybody has, yes, Christine.
Well, I also think that, you know, pulling somebody into your service is also, the conscription thing is absolutely immediately what I thought of. But it's also, these are people who can protect him.
Mm.
And you know, they are going to be personally loyal to him.
Good. Good.
Yeah, that's what he's doing. He's uniting the tribes. The tribes are being plundered, especially the southern tribes are being plundered by the Amalekites that are coming up because that's their trade route, you know, that Mesopotamia, you know, and to Egypt. So he's breaking it so that he can, because they want to protect their trade route.
It's interesting that at this time, there's no threat from an empire because first of all, you have Mesopotamia on sort of on one side and Egypt on the other, and they're constantly vying for control over Judea because it's on the way to the next empire, right? So they're constantly,
yeah, it's the freeway.
Yeah. So, you know, later on, you're going to see the Assyrians and then the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Persians and the Romans and, you know, so you just constantly have all of these different empires that are taking over. Sometimes you have Egyptians taking over. Right now, it seems like the biggest threat is from this one group in the Gaza area. So not much has changed, right? In all these years, we still have a threat from the Gaza area.
But he's also uniting the tribes. You know, the tribes that are busy fighting, you know, he's helping them keep their land. So here he's getting them on his side.
Good.
This is starting the beginning of uniting the kingdom.
Yep.
And he's also taking the men who are the most likely to be good soldiers for their own people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, he's kind of plundering his own, you know, the tribes for their best fighting people.
Good. All right. So let's go on to the next chapter. And Jane, do you want to keep reading a little bit?
Sure. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys.
Okay, hang on just 1 second. I want to show you Deuteronomy. Let's see, 25:18, where we find out about the Amalekites. Oops, I put 2:25:18. That's not going to get me anywhere. Okay, here we go. All right, let's see. So I'm going to share this one verse. So here he says, when you were weary and worn out, they were talking about the Amalekites, met you on your journey and attacked all who are lagging behind. So this is why the Amalekites are the sort of, you know, most evil group, because they attacked who are the laggards in a march from someplace. This is when the Israelites were leaving Egypt and they were, you know, walking through the desert to get to the promised land. So who would be the laggards?
The most vulnerable.
The most vulnerable, the old people, the infirm. which is, that's really low, attacking those people of all people, right? The ones who are slower because they're older, because they have some sort of infirmity or whatever it is. So they're absolutely the, what's the word? Evil incarnate. Remember who Haman is from?
The Amalekites?
Yep. You'll see why in a second. So basically God is saying you need to completely obliterate anything of them, right? Harem. That's basically like being, kicked out of the club. But in this case, it's complete destruction of all of their things and all of their people. So, okay, now I need to. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it God saying this or Samuel? Sounds like Samuel saying it.
Well, he's repeating here. Let me share this.
Okay.
He's saying, this is what God says, I will punish the Amalekites.
I got past that. Okay.
Yeah. So he's saying, this is what God said.
Okay.
Presumably he's not lying. Who knows? Right. But you have to destroy everything, men, women, children. I mean, this is pretty horrible, really, when you think about it.
It's genocide.
It's genocide. And actually, somebody wrote me the other day and said, I'm really having a problem with the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. It's so horrible. And I said, yeah, there's lots of other horrible passages. This being one. Deuteronomy has a whole thing about, wiping out the Canaanites. And so I've mentioned this before, but my strategy for dealing with this is threefold. One, you problematize the text. You say, this is horrible. You don't pretend. I've seen people pretend that their holy scriptures do not have horrible things in there. No, we do have horrible things, and we have to cop to that. Two, you historicize it. This was written at a time. Now, I'm not to say that this doesn't happen today, but in that day and age, this is how things were done. This is how your enemy was treated. Hopefully that is not any longer how we feel that it's okay to fight. But then again, we see that it still happens. But you historicize it, and then you spiritualize it. So you look at this as a metaphor for perhaps destroying the idolatry within you, or destroying the, really very ungenerous way in which these people are operating. And so those are strategies to deal with these difficult texts, but let's not pretend they're not there. And don't forget, we're not a theoretically literal tradition, even though there are, unfortunately, some really right-wing rabbis in Israel who say, see, it says we should destroy the Canaanites, and that's what the Palestinians are, even though the Talmud makes it very clear that none of these people exist anymore, and therefore this is no longer valid. Christine, go ahead.
Well, also, it's also a like one of those warnings about kingship, because states always are on the precipice of committing genocide. It goes along with states in general. And I'm not an anarchist, okay, or like in case anybody's jumping forward there. But part of state formation is erasing the notion that that your enemies are human.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, Jenny.
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna follow up on Christine, what you just said, and also Rabbi, what you have said previously, that this is also a political document. And so the victors, not only do they write the story, but they also control, the narrative, and you can make your enemies look, really bad.
Absolutely. And by the way, here's what Rashi says about the Amalekites. Apparently, they were sorcerers who could transform themselves to resemble animals, and thus the animals had to be killed, because he's trying to explain why it's okay to kill the animals. What did the animals do to anybody, right? He says that the Amalekites were able to transform themselves into animals. There you go. You can always find a justification for anything, especially in Midrash.
Yeah, especially the children, right? Because
the children. Right. Yeah, right. Well, there were the Satmar Rebbe said that the Holocaust was a punishment for assimilation. So I guess the children were future assimilationists, right? So yeah, unfortunately, you can justify anything if you twist the stuff enough. All right, any other comments? Okay, yeah.
Oh, I was saying, I just to sort of go back about my comment earlier about the Philistines, I was just reading that apparently in the Bible, I don't know this, so I'm just repeating what I read. There's no reference to their accomplishments as a seafaring people, that they were very accomplished.
The Philistines, yes.
Very accomplished at seafaring, and their pottery, so there's other evidence that doesn't show up in the Bible about their culture. So they weren't just warriors,
Yeah.
But again, you're not going to read about their accomplishments, right?
Good. Okay, thank you for that. That's good. The Amalekites maybe had some good accomplishments too, aside from being sorcerers, but we don't know about them. Okay, so let's okay. All right. So Jane.
Okay. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, "Go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt." So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites.
Okay, so the Kenites are supposedly the descendants of Jethro, Jethro being Moses's father-in-law.
Oh, okay.
And remember the Kenites, remember Yael was married to a Kenite, and she's the one who killed Sisera, who was the general from the opposing army. So the Kenites have been allies of the Israelites.
Okay. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites,
Amalekites
all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed.
Okay, so they were supposed to destroy everything and everybody. They saved the king and they saved all this good stuff. And let's see what happens when Saul figures this out.
Okay. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. "I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and he has not carried out my instructions." Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, "Saul is gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal."
So here he is, he's already, self-aggrandizing, right? Didn't take long.
He's celebrating.
Yeah.
When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?"
Okay, let's stop for just 1 second. So Saul says, "I did exactly what you told me to do," which is of course not true, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you hear the bleating of the sheep, which is sort of like, the kid eating the cookie with, chocolate smeared on their face. "No, I didn't eat it," right? So here's this bleating sheep. And there's a note that maybe he should have listened to God's voice instead of having the sheep's voice come along, right? Remember, he's already supposedly finished as far as having a dynasty, right? Because he already did something Samuel didn't like, right? He offered the sacrifices, but now this is either another story, or in the first one, maybe he did what Samuel told, he went against Samuel's wishes. Now he's going against God's wishes. In any event, there are at least two reasons that he's no longer going to have, any descendants who are going to be his followers or successors rather. So here, you did everything I said, but I hear some sheep. What the hell is that?
Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. That's interesting. But we totally destroyed the
Okay,
rest.
so what is he saying here? What is he saying here?
Well, we kept the best because we're going to sacrifice them.
Right. Which is not the reason they kept the best, right? They liked what they saw. Why should we destroy this? There's some good cattle, some good sheep, some good whatever. And then now, Samuel, first of all, Saul is sort of throwing his soldiers under the bus, right? Well, they kind of, did this. I had nothing to do with it. And the whole reason was because they were trying to serve God, which is sort of a way of trying to flatter God when he's been caught red-handed, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it was interesting that he said the Lord your God instead of the Lord our God.
Oh, good.
I think that's very interesting.
I hadn't
Is that
noticed
the
that.
way it says in the Hebrew?
Very good.
The English here.
I don't. Let's see what's the. You can't. Where is it?
15.
The Lord your God. Good point. Let me just see. This is chapter 15. Let me see if I can find the Hebrew in the other book. Wait a minute. Okay, chapter 15, verse, what is it? 15? Yeah.
No, it's 1 Samuel 15. Well, mine. Oh.
Isn't it verse 15? Yeah.
Yeah, verse 15.
All right, let me find verse 15 here. I'm still in chapter 14, 15, 15. It goes on forever. Okay, let's see. Where's. All right, here's 15. All right. Okay, Vayomer Shaul. Asher Hama. Adonai Elohecha. It says, yes, God, Adonai, your God, is exactly what it says. But we totally destroyed the rest. Well, we did everything else that you said, it's like not enough. Okay.
Enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Have I got a secret for you?
Yeah.
Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord appointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?
Remember, they pounced on other plunder too. So this is the first time they pounced.
But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal.
So he's lying again, second time. Let's say the same lie again. And as we found out, maybe sometimes if you say it 3 or 4 times, it'll actually be reality. Okay.
But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king.
So in other words, unlike Isaiah, right? Isaiah says God doesn't want your sacrifices because God wants you to, take care of the poor and the vulnerable in society. Here, what Samuel's saying is God doesn't want your sacrifices. God wants total obedience. It's a little scary. Lynn, did you? No. Okay. Anybody have a comment?
Well, I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I keep thinking early on in this reading, there was a part where Samuel says, you will not remain king. You have disappointed and all this, and then here it's coming back again. But I'm looking at it from Saul's perspective. Everything's going very well, right? I mean, he's getting all these victories. He's uniting. He's probably feeling like a very successful king. The only person who's telling him he's not is Samuel.
That's a very good point.
From his perspective, Samuel's like gaslighting him, like telling him how terrible he is and that the whole country's falling apart. And he's like, look around, man, everything's working. We're routing our enemies left and right. So, yes, if from Samuel's perspective, Saul is lying, but Saul has no way of knowing that Samuel's telling him the truth, because it looks to him like God is favoring him because things are going so well. So it's almost like, I'm not sure how much is this Samuel just trying to exert influence. We don't know what he heard. We don't know what conversations he really had with God or anyone. It's just, we're just at his word of, so why do we trust him to be the accurate one here? I don't know.
That's a very good point. But it also makes me think about the fact that in the whole historical section here, which is, basically Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that's the whole historical, which is called Deuteronomic history, because it's influenced by the theology of the book of Deuteronomy, where if you are obedient to God, things will go well. And if you're not, you're going to be punished. The fact of the matter is that the kings who are the most politically savvy and economically savvy are the ones who are the least faithful to God. And the ones who are the most faithful to God, the favored kings like Hezekiah, are actually really militarily and politically not so good. So that's a strange irony here.
Well, I always think that that's, part of that great warning about kingship, right? Be careful what you want. You want a king? This is what a king is. And we can try to contain him with good advisors and so on and so forth. But basically, you're always going to get the guy that wants the portrait at Mar-a-Lago.
Right. Except again, like Hezekiah is a good king, but he makes some pretty fatal mistakes, and gets killed. It's just interesting, especially because it was written by the victors. Somehow having faith in God is not what gets them to be a successful country. And the ones who are the least, faithful are the ones, for example, Ahab. So Ahab, marries a woman from, he marries, what's her name? Jezebel, right? And he and some other kings, like even Solomon, because they marry women from different, countries or whatever, they're making political alliances that are actually to their benefit. Whereas the pure kings aren't making those alliances because they want to stay pure, and that is not politically beneficial. So there's a contradiction right there, even though God supposedly is there, but then it gets read as, well, God's punishing you because you sinned somehow. The people sinned, Suzanne, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about what Samuel says about to obey is better than to sacrifice. And in context here, Saul's not even really about sacrifice. Saul's lying and saying he's going to sacrifice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're saying, oh yeah, I mean, yes, it's true that it's extolling the virtues of obedience, but it's really also saying it's better to do what you were told to do rather than to lie and pretend you're doing what you were told to do.
Good point.
And to keep lying, right?
Yeah.
I had a question about Agag. They brought the king of the other side and they trotted him out. Is he intended for sacrifice? I don't
wait,
why they spared him.
No, he wasn't supposed to spare him.
No, I know he wasn't. Right.
Why he did, I mean, we don't know. It could be because from one king to the other, let's not, like noblesse oblige, whatever. We don't want to have, you go through what everybody else is going through. It's not clear why he did, but let's just finish the story and you'll see what happens. And then we'll talk about Haman too. All right, so we're 24, I believe, right? Do you mind, Jane?
Yeah. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them.
So that's
Now
again his MO, you know, his
Yeah.
MO is he tries to please everybody. He's not someone who has, you know, got his own convictions or his own instructions and follows them. If the men get antsy or afraid or whatever, then he gives in to them. And this has been his downfall. Go ahead.
Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. Samuel turned to leave. Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore.
Now remember this scene for when much later with David and Saul, but this idea of holding on to the hem of his robe and tearing it. Just keep that image in your mind for probably a few weeks from now.
Okay. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you.
He's so mean.
Yeah, that is mean.
Yeah.
He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind.
Which of course we know is not true, right? How many times did God change God's mind about punishing people? Just think about Book of Jonah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry,
And
somebody's
also, you know, going back to what you said just a few minutes ago, Saul is so different when we read about David. He's not trying to please anybody. He's enraged all the time.
yeah, well, I think
You
Samuel, you
know.
know, if you have someone abusing you emotionally as much as Samuel
Right.
has, it could turn you into somebody who is no longer completely mentally healthy.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sure he's not at that point.
No.
Okay. Then Samuel said, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him in change.
Okay, wait 1 second. You skipped 30, which I think is
Oh,
important.
I'm sorry.
Because it sounds
Oh,
the
I'm
same.
sorry.
It's he repeats
Yeah.
himself.
Okay. Saul replied, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel.
Thank you. So Agag is killed. However, you notice he wasn't killed immediately. So apparently he had time to go home and sleep with his wife, had some sort of descendant who eventually became Haman.
Oh.
That's the midrash on this. I mean, obviously he's been told you're going to be childless after this, right? Because you're not going to be here to make a kid. But Haman, you know, so every time there's somebody really horrible, some sort of evil person, they are somehow from the Amalekites. And so Haman being one, Hitler, you know, but
anybody with an H name.
I was actually thinking Saddam Hussein. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so according to the Midrash, the reason there is a Haman is because, I mean, look, the story of Purim is pretty fanciful. It's not, you know, a historical story. But anyway, that's what the rabbis say, that Haman came from Agag, and if Saul had killed him right away, there wouldn't have been a Haman. You know, that's kind of an interesting little fairy tale. But so, I mean, Saul is still going to reign from now on, but he's going to reign knowing that his son is not going to be the next king, his son Jonathan. So that's a pretty heavy burden to carry with you, knowing that God is pretty angry at you as you continue to rule. And this is just really the beginning of his reign, in a sense. He just, had all these victories, and he just put up a monument to himself. Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
And going back to what Jason says, as far as Saul is concerned, everything is going really well. I mean, he is now really a king. He has gotten the taste for power. And what I think is fascinating about the rest of Saul's life is knowing that God has abandoned him and his continuing to fight for the kingship and his dynasty.
Right.
I mean, that's just fascinating on so many levels.
What's also interesting is Saul seems upset. I mean, Samuel now seems upset at what's going on to poor Saul.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of set him up for failure from the beginning. He's abused him emotionally, really. And now, he's upset. So let's just look at the beginning of the next chapter. Okay, so I'll just read it. So the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul?" Like, he's mourning for Saul, and he made this happen himself. It's like self-fulfilling prophecy. "Since I've rejected him as king over Israel." Like, this is what I want. You should be happy because it's what I want. I'm God, and you're just Samuel. "Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." So Jesse is David's father. And Samuel is going to go find this guy. But Samuel says, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me." I mean, he figures Saul's pretty angry that Samuel, basically demoted him. God said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to God. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what God said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Because who knows what Samuel has to say. Maybe Samuel will say to them, "You've sinned, and now we're going to punish you too." Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I've come to sacrifice to God. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." And Eliab is undoubtedly one of the older sons. Let me just look here. He saw Eliab. Okay, here, this is what Alter has to say. "Nothing could illustrate more vividly Samuel's persistent unreliability as a seer." Because he's looking at the wrong guy, right? This is not the guy who's going to be the next king. "Having made a fatal mistake by electing Saul, head and shoulders taller than all the people, convinced he was directed by God, and maybe it was not God's choice to pick Saul, but that's what Samuel picked. Samuel is poised to repeat his error in being impressed by the appearance and lofty stature of Jesse's firstborn." Now, if there's one thing we know about the Bible, it's that the firstborn never becomes the next leader.
Anything.
Right? So he's looking at the firstborn. That's already missing something. But he says in verse 7, "But God says to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." God does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. He's already made the mistake with Saul. Now he's about to make it again. This whole story is also a heightened and stylized playing out of the theme of the reversal of primogeniture that dominates Genesis. Again, primogeniture is the oldest son. The oldest son always inherits more than the younger son. But here, even though the laws of people are such that the older son is, in a sense, the favored one, we find out over and over again that that's not how God works. It's always a younger son that wins out. Instead of an elder and a younger son, Jesse has the formulaic 7 sons, plus an eighth, the youngest of all who will be chosen. So he's got 8 sons. So then Jesse calls Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then God said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So of course, God just said, don't worry about outward appearances. This guy has a very good looking outward appearance as well. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Okay, so we're not going to go further, but we're going to now begin the story of David, which is going to be very interesting in terms of his relationship with King Saul and King Saul's various children, his daughters, his son, etc. It's really a great story. And actually, it is, for those of you who have literary backgrounds, the arc of the story is very much the tragedy. It's like things go really, really, really well, and they achieve a certain peak, and then they start to go really, really, really badly. And we'll see that in the course of the story of David. So any last comments about Saul, Samuel, David, Jesse, anybody?
Well, just something foreshadowing David. I don't know if anyone's read or likes Malcolm Gladwell's writings, but his book, David and Goliath, is kind of a different sort of understanding of the stories that we're going to get to. And he actually thinks that he sees it as opposite from how most people interpret the story. And I just think if anybody wants to get a different take on what that whole thing is about, you might want to seek out that book. I think he also has a podcast episode about it, which I could look for. But it's just, very different way of looking at it. And
can you give us a hint?
Well, he actually says David's not the underdog at all. And that when we talk about, and he extrapolates this to how we think about large companies versus small companies and power in the world. But he's basically saying, we always say, a David is an underdog and a Goliath is the expected victor. And as he points out, all the advantage in the actual scenario are with David. And why we've consistently called him an underdog is either a misunderstanding or an intentional misinterpretation, just because we like the idea of the giant being felled. But it's interesting, very interesting.
Yeah. So Lynn, just one second. Yeah, I mean, actually, when you find out what supposedly Goliath's condition was and what the, throwing of the rock is all about, you find out that it's not, this big, strong giant against a poor kid with a slingshot. It's a whole other thing, which we'll get to. But Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, there's another less serious book that sort of tells the David story. And I guess I'm only midway through the book right now. It's a fiction, totally fiction, and by Joseph Heller, called God Knows. And it goes through David and starts with Saul, but mostly about David. And it's really interesting take. Not at all serious, I don't think, but it's an interesting take if anybody wanted to look at that.
Well, maybe you'll share it with us when we resume.
I'm about halfway through it right now. So.
Okay, great.
I feel like maybe I read that at like 30 years ago, but
yeah, it's an old book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you've read other things about David, it'd be great to share those other perspectives. But it's 11:31, so I will end the class.
First, did we leave off with? I lost track. What verse?
We are. Wait, let me look. We are on. Oh, sometimes my screen goes black. Verse 14.
We did verse 14. Okay.
Verse 14 of chapter.
That's 15. Where we'll start next time.
Yes.
Okay. Rabbi, the part on David and Goliath in the book, David and Goliath. It's only 12 pages. It's not a whole book. It's just
Okay,
an
so
article. And
You
it's
guys
really-
read it and
it's
give us
really
some
good.
information.
Yeah.
I'm glad I was just looking for my copy earlier and I think I must have checked it out of the library or something. Or gave it
Well,
I couldn't
maybe
find it.
Jane can read it and give us a little synopsis
Oh,
next time.
yeah, I'd be glad to do that.
Okay.
Hey, maybe you could scan the pages and send them out to us.
I don't know how to do that, but if my husband can do it, I'll scan it to the rabbi and she'll send it out.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay?
Okay. Have Shabbat
Yeah.
Shalom. Have a great
Shabbat
weekend.
shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.